The following story is based on true events that have happened in the past, are happening right now all over the world, and will happen to you soon. While the story is terrifying, know that each of these disasters could have been prevented. This is how it will go down for most people, but it doesn't have to go down this way for you. In part two, I will tell this story of what this family could have done to prevent all of these terrible things from happening. Let's say you are the perfect family living the American dream. Dad is an electrical engineer with a six-figure salary. Mom is a nursing assistant, and they have three kids, two girls, 15 and 12, and a boy, 7. They have a cat named Fluffy and a dog named Betsy. They live in a nice home, in a nice neighborhood, and the value of their home is well above the mortgage they have on it. They have health insurance and two pension funds they contribute to. They also own a BMW, a minivan, a motorcycle, and a small powerboat in the garage. Week 1. One day, Mom drives to the local mall to pick up some groceries. The first thing she notices is that a quarter of the stores in the mall have shut down. When she starts shopping at the grocery store, she is shocked to see the price of a loaf of bread has gone from $2 to $5. Milk went from $3 a quart to $7.50 a quart, and ground hamburger went from $3 a pound to $9. All in all, her weekly grocery bill has more than doubled from last week. At dinner that night, Mom tells Dad about the rising cost of food, but Dad has some worrying news too. The company he works for is planning to lay off 20% of the workforce. Not to worry, Dad has seniority, and he won't be one of the employees that will lose their job. They turn on the TV and the nightly news tells them that the stock market is booming, but due to trade tariffs, the cost of living may go up by 3%. The next day, Dad gets the utility bill, and his jaw drops when he sees the monthly electrical bill has gone from $300 a month to $1,200. On the way to work, he stops at the gas station to fill up and is again shocked to see the cost of a gallon of gas has gone from $5 per gallon to $15 per gallon. It costs $400 just to fill up the tank. That night, Dad does a budget and realizes that their monthly expenses now exceed their income. They need to tighten the belt, and so the first thing to go is the eldest daughter's music lessons, then middle daughter's dance lessons, and also Junior's karate lessons. Dad cancels his membership at the tennis club, and Mom cancels her membership at the Pilates studio. Also, no eating lunch at the cafe, and no more coffees from Starbucks. To save on the electric and gas bills, they need to keep most of the lights turned off and the heat turned down. Everyone will need to wear a sweater in the house. Also, Mom and Dad will have to carpool to save on gas. Dad will drop Mom off at work and pick her up after he gets off work. The next day, Dad learns that the company plans to lay off another 30% of the workforce. Everyone at the office is tense and nervous. Dad still has seniority, but just to be on the safe side, he starts to send out his resume. What Dad doesn't know is that there are 50,000 other electrical engineers also sending out their resumes, and most would work for a lot less money than Dad is currently earning. Week 2. The next week, Mom goes to buy the groceries, but discovers that the mall is closed. She drives through town looking for a grocery store that's still in business, passing storefront after storefront that have been closed down, with plywood over the windows and for lease signs everywhere. She finally finds a store still open and goes inside. Half the shelves are empty, and bread now goes for $25 per loaf and milk at $50 a quart. Mom can barely afford a quarter pound of ground hamburger and a half a dozen packs of instant noodles. Mom also buys a couple of cans of cat food, figuring if she mixes it in with the noodles, no one will notice. At least it will be enough to feed the family for a few days. When she exits the store, she is confronted by dozens of women and children begging for food. Mom rushes past the beggars with her small supply of groceries and notices groups of men lurking in the parking lot. Mom ducks down between the cars and carefully makes her way back to her car, gets in and speeds away, with men running down the road after her. That night, there is a banging on the front door. It's their neighbor Bob from 3 doors down. He's begging for food. He tells them he's been let off and his family hasn't eaten in 3 days. He's wild-eyed and desperate. Mom scoops a bowl full of noodles and cat food into a baggie and gives it to him. "That's all we can spare, I'm sorry," she says. Later that night, they hear a gunshot. Bob has committed suicide. Dad decides they need to sell the motorcycle, the boat, and the extra car. But everyone is selling, and no one has money to buy. He sells the $15,000 motorcycle for $200. The car fetches $250, and no one wants the boat. Not enough money to even buy a week's worth of food. The only thing that still has some value is gold and silver. They go through Mom's jewelry case to find anything with gold or silver in it. Mom hands Dad her engagement and wedding rings. Dad decides they also need to cash in their retirement plans. The jewelry and retirement funds should last them 2 months. Week 3. That Monday, Mom finds out she has been let go. The hospital where she worked can no longer afford to keep such a large staff on hand. Mom waits in the hospital cafeteria that no longer serves food all day for her husband to come and pick her up. The next day, Dad arrives at work to find his co-workers gathered outside the front doors that had been locked, with a sign in the window that simply said, "Out of business." No one was even allowed in to clean out their desks. There will be no severance pay and no pension. That night, Dad calls all his friends, business associates, college alumni, and even high school friends he hadn't seen in 20 years, asking for help finding work. Dad never received even one response from the 300 resumes he'd sent out. But the story is always the same. Everyone is being laid off, and no one is hiring. But one person told Dad if he goes to the closed-down mall and waits in the parking lot, there's a chance he'll be hired as a day laborer, doing construction or yard work. Dad left the house at 4 a.m. to walk the 6 miles to the mall, where he milled about with 80 other men until 10 at night. He did that every day for a week, but no one came around to offer any work, and Dad didn't go back. That night, there was the sound of breaking glass and yelling coming from down the street. The sky in the distance lit up from the fires started in some of the abandoned houses. There were no longer any emergency sirens. The police, ambulance, and fire departments were not responding to 911 calls. The next morning, Dad gets some tools and lumber from the garage and boards up all the ground floor windows. He goes in the attic and retrieves Great-Grandpa's 1911 Colt .45 that he had brought back from the war. There were 6 bullets in the box, and Dad loaded them in the magazine. Mail was no longer being delivered to homes, and Mom had to bicycle 5 miles to the post office once a week to pick up the mail. There was a letter from the township announcing that property taxes had been quadrupled and made retroactive, and that they now owed $9,000 in back taxes. The electric bill had doubled again. Instead of having 2 months' worth of money to pay expenses, they were now 6 months behind. There was nothing left to do but to sell the house. Dad called a real estate agent he met at the Lions Club, but the number was out of service. He called another 10 brokers listed in the Yellow Pages until he found one that answered the phone. She told Dad that they would no longer represent sellers. Everyone was selling, and no one was buying. She entered his address into the computer and told him the average selling price for homes in his area. It was less than half their modest mortgage. Even if they could find a buyer, they would still owe money. The real estate agent confided that Dad's best option was to stop paying all bills and live in the home and save as much money as they can until they are evicted. Week 4. The next day the power was cut. So were the gas and the phones. It was fortunate they had a fireplace in the den, and so they brought down their mattresses and blankets, and everyone slept in the den. Dad would stay up late to feed the fire, so they wouldn't all wake up freezing at 4 in the morning. There was no money to buy pet food for Fluffy and Betsy, and both were looking thin. Although an indoor cat, Mom let Fluffy out, in the hopes that her instincts would return and she could hunt for herself. Fluffy never came back. One night the middle daughter developed a chronic cough. Mom's nursing experience told her she was suffering from respiratory bacterial infection. She needed antibiotics, but they would need to visit a clinic first. Thank God they still had health insurance. Dad siphoned the gas from the boat's tank and hoped it would be enough to drive their daughter to the nearest hospital. The hospital was packed. They had to park a mile away, and when they arrived at emergency, there were 200 people there, yelling and screaming at the dozen heavily armed security guards that surrounded the admissions desk. They waited 14 hours to reach reception. They were then told that their health insurance company had increased the deductible to $10,000 and that a doctor's consultation would cost $6,000 cash in advance. No amount of begging and pleading would get their daughter admitted without the upfront payment. When they got home, Mom bundled middle daughter up in blankets and lit the fire to keep her warm. Mom used every home remedy she could think of to treat her daughter, but while the symptoms eased a little, she wasn't getting any better either. The next day, eldest daughter announced she was leaving to work at the seedy strip club outside of town. A girlfriend told her that she could earn $2,000 a week, and if she were to take on a few clients, even more. Because the roads were so dangerous, she would stay in one of the rooms at the club and be back in 3 weeks with the money to get little sister the medical help she needs. Dad said absolutely not. He would not sell his 15-year-old daughter into prostitution. But after much arguing and tears, Mom and daughter convinced Dad that there really was no other way. That eldest daughter was going to save her sister's life and save the family, and that everyone must sacrifice in order to survive. Week 5. A week after eldest daughter left, Dad walked down the street going door to door to see if any of his neighbors still had phone service. The once tidy and quaint neighborhood looked like a war zone. More than half the homes had been abandoned, each with a large pile of garbage and discarded furniture in the front yard. Several had been burnt down. When he knocked on the doors of those houses that didn't look abandoned, no one answered. Several times he heard movement inside, but no one answered the door. Finally, he found a home that answered the door, shotgun in hand. It was Jeff, one of the fathers he would see at his daughter's dance recitals. Jeff still had a functional landline that he allowed Dad to use. Dad first called the Strip-O-Rama and asked to speak to his daughter. The woman who answered told Dad that she no longer worked there, that she left with her boyfriend and no one knows where they went. That's all Dad could find out, but he knew eldest daughter would never leave the family. A sickening realization sunk in that she was probably trafficked into the sex slave trade. There would be no way to find her. Dad next called his uncle, who had a big house outside of town and whom he hoped would allow him and his family to move in with him. But there was no answer. Finally, Dad called the Government Information Helpline, where a recorded message informed callers that until further notice, all government services were suspended, that a homeless area had been designated underneath the highway overpass, and that emergency food supplies will be distributed every Thursday. That night, middle daughter passed away from her illness. The next morning, Dad walked back to the neighbor to again use the phone to call an ambulance, but there was only a recording stating that emergency services had been suspended. Dad called hospitals and funeral homes, but there was no answer. When he arrived home, there was an eviction notice on the front door. Mom was found rocking back and forth, with her remaining child held in her arms. She was silent, her face frozen in despair. Dad buried middle daughter in the backyard. Then he loaded the minivan with clothes, blankets, and sleeping bags, some camping supplies, and what little food they had left. Dad picked up Mom and carried her to the van, with the little boy following behind. Dad told Mom that they had to be strong and survive. They still had a young son to take care of, and that eldest daughter will be okay and find her way back to them soon. But Mom said nothing and continued to stare out the window. Dad stapled a note on the front door in case his eldest daughter came home, saying, "We have gone to the overpass homeless camp. Look for our van. Love, Dad." Before they left, Dad found Betsy the dog, dead, curled up on her favorite blanket in the kitchen near her empty food bowl. He buried her next to his daughter. They drove to the designated homeless area where there were hundreds of cars, campers, trucks, and tents under the overpass. They slowly drove along the overpass looking for a spot to park, passing dozens of open fires surrounded by people huddling for warmth. Dad cooked some instant noodles on the propane stove and put on a brave face for Mom and his son, and told them so long as they stick together as a family, everything will be all right. Mom didn't reply and continued to stare into the distance. Dad was also worried for his son, since he had become increasingly afraid and had developed a tremor, and often burst into tears and would cry for hours, and Dad's efforts to comfort him were in vain. Week 6. 3 days later, the emergency food truck arrived, and Dad was disappointed to discover that his ration pack consisted of 3 packs of instant noodles and 3 hot dogs. As he walked back to the van, he could smell barbecued meat coming from several of the campfires. When he went to find out where the meat came from, he was told it was the family dog or cat. or a pigeon someone had caught. Dad cooked up the noodles and put all 3 hot dogs in the pot, since they hadn't eaten in 2 days. Then he took his Colt 45 and headed into the nearby ravine, determined to shoot a raccoon or a squirrel or maybe a goose. Dad walked through the ravine until dusk without even seeing an animal of any kind. Dad was determined to go out again the next day and find something to kill. When he returned to the van, he discovered that men had come while he was gone and stole his camping equipment and sleeping bags. His son was curled up in a fetal position, hiding under the van. Mom was sitting in the front seat, staring out the window. That night, they put on all the clothes they had and huddled together for warmth in the van. Mom and Dad could not sleep because of the fear, anxiety, and hunger they felt. In the early morning, a gang of armed men came to rob the homeless camp of anything of value. Some of the homeless had firearms and fired shots to defend themselves, but the gang was heavily armed and sprayed the camp indiscriminately with gunfire, killing dozens of people. A stray bullet pierced the side of the van and went through the young boy and Mom, killing both instantly. Clutching the bodies of his wife and son close to him, Dad watched the sun come up and then went to bury his family in the ravine. After he was done, he put the barrel of his Colt 45 to his temple, and his last words before pulling the trigger was, "I am so sorry." The following story will show how the events described in Part 1 could be avoided. Let's say there is a perfect family living the American dream. Dad is an electrical engineer with a 6-figure salary. Mom is a nursing assistant, and they have 3 kids, 2 girls, 15 and 12, and a boy, 7. They have a cat named Fluffy and a dog named Betsy. They also live in a nice home in a nice neighborhood. They have health insurance and 2 pensions. They also own a BMW, a minivan, a motorcycle, and a small powerboat. 3 months earlier. Dad is just your average guy, hardworking, who cares about his family, community, and church. He's not one of those crazy conspiracy guys, but he knows enough not to ever trust a politician, and he takes what he sees on the news with a big grain of salt. He's not one of those wacky apocalypse prepper guys, but he keeps an emergency kit in the car, and he's pretty handy around the house. Each night, the nightly news tells him the economy is solid. Lots of jobs, jobs, jobs. And the stock market is up. But driving into work each day for the past few months, Dad noticed that there were more and more empty office spaces. That there are even a couple of prime retail locations that have closed down. One time, he went off his regular route and drove past a homeless camp set up under one of the overpasses. If the economy is doing so well, why are businesses still closing down? And if there are so many jobs, why are there whole families living in the streets? Dad felt uneasy, and it reminded him of a conversation he had as a young man with his grandpa, who was just a boy during the Great Depression. Grandpa told him stories of what life was like then, how they were always cold and hungry. Granddad told him that they should always have 3 months' worth of food stored away. 6 months would be even better. That was a long time ago, and Dad never thought much about it since, but he did know that he would never want his family to suffer like Grandpa did. That weekend, Dad sat at the computer and did a lot of research. Mom wanted to know why Dad was so serious and what he was researching, but Dad told her, "I'll tell you everything once I've got this figured out." On Sunday night, Dad called Mom aside and told her of his plan. Mom didn't like it and thought Dad had gone off his rocker. But Dad explained it was just like an insurance policy, something to keep the family safe. And besides, if nothing happened, there is still value they could reclaim from their efforts. Dad reminded Mom of the stories Grandpa used to tell, and she reluctantly agreed to go along with his plans. Then Dad called the kids in and told them that for the next 3 months, all their classes will be on hold, that they will be enrolled in special classes that Dad had chosen for them. And those new smartphones everybody wants for Christmas? Not happening this year. They'll just have to use their old phones for a while longer. The kids were not happy about the news, but Dad understood that to be a good father, you sometimes need to be a good general. A general that has to make hard decisions to keep his troops safe. Instead of buying $3,000 worth of smartphones, Dad took $1,000 and bought 2 handheld shortwave radios and a 100-watt base station. Mom and Dad would each keep one of the portable radios in the car, and the base station would be set up in the study. If ever the phones went out, the family would still be able to talk to each other if they were separated, and they could also tune in and get news from around the world. Then he used the rest of the money to buy a 9mm pistol and a 12-gauge shotgun for himself. 2 .380 pistols, one for Mom and one for eldest daughter, a .22 caliber semi-auto rifle for middle daughter, and finally a .22 caliber Browning pistol for youngest son. Dad knew that police don't actually prevent crime. They only arrive to tag the bodies, and he was going to make damn sure that his family could protect themselves whether or not police are still in service. Using the money saved from canceling everyone's lessons and memberships, Dad enrolled the whole family in weekend courses for the next 3 months. First, everyone took an emergency first aid and CPR course. The next 2 weeks were spent taking a ham radio course. Everyone would need to know how to operate the radios. Then, 5 weekends at the shooting range, so that everyone, even youngest son, would know how to use every weapon they had, and everyone would need to pass the firearms safety course. Then, the final 6 weeks would be spent taking self-defense lessons and a weekly trip to the gun range. Meanwhile, Mom had her duties too. First, she put together an extensive first aid kit. She also used her friendship with one of the doctors at the hospital to get prescriptions for penicillin, amoxicillin, and tetracycline that she filled and refilled and stored at home. Another part of Dad's plan was to make friends and build community. One thing Grandpa told him was that their family survived the Great Depression in part to great-granddad's friendship with the local farmers. Once a week he would go out to the country where he could trade for some potatoes, fresh eggs, and once a month a chicken or maybe some sausage. So on Sundays, Mom went to the farmer's market. Mom would bake some cookies and put 6 in small bags, and when she bought some produce or meat from any of the vendors, she would thank them and give them a little bag of cookies. Soon she became known as the Cookie Lady, and Mom got to know several of the local farmers and where their farms were. Since Mom was making weekly trips to the market anyways, she went to one of the seniors' buildings and offered to buy and deliver a weekly order for those that can no longer make it to the farmer's market. In this way, Mom could buy many items at a bulk discount, saving on her grocery bill, which would help because the food prices were rising every month. Mom also went to the nursery and bought some heirloom seeds for a full vegetable garden, enough for 3 seasons. She also picked up some topsoil and some planters. Over the next 3 months, Dad did what he could to build a network. He attended the Lions Club and Rotarian meetings, where he asked to speak for a few minutes. Dad proposed the idea of forming a volunteer citizen search and rescue team. Their town was subject to floods, forest fires, and severe winter storms, and often the local emergency services were quickly overwhelmed. A volunteer group could offer additional life-saving services in the event of a natural disaster. They would register as a nonprofit and would seek donations to pay for training and equipment. Once a month, they would meet at one of the library meeting rooms, where they would bring in different instructors in first aid, CPR, and search and rescue. Then they bought bright red jackets with Volunteer Search and Rescue emblazoned on the back and Red Cross and team patches on the front. Then each member would be outfitted with radios, flashlights, medical kits, ropes, and other equipment. Volunteer disaster response groups usually work in coordination with local police and fire departments, so this would give Dad an opportunity to make contacts with local law enforcement and first responders. In this way, Dad was able to assemble, equip, and train a small group of rugged men and women that could work together as a team. During peacetime, they would provide life-saving services to their community. However, during war and civil unrest, such groups often morph into paramilitary and guerrilla units. In addition, in case of martial law, where travel is restricted, a small group outfitted and identified as a rescue team would have a much better chance of getting through the police checkpoints. Dad also called his uncle that lived alone in a large house with a few acres out in the country. The next weekend he drove out there with a bottle of Crown Royal, a box of dog treats for Uncle's dog Barney, and a big tray of lasagna Mom had cooked. Dad told Uncle about his concerns and his contingency plans. Uncle told him that Dad and his family are welcome anytime, no need to call ahead. Finally, Dad did something he didn't want to do. Everyone had to sacrifice something, and so Dad sold his boat. He loved that boat, but truth be told, he had not taken it out in almost 6 years. With the money, he first bought a year's supply of food, including cat and dog food for Fluffy and Betsy. Then he had burglar bars installed on all the first-floor windows and doors. He also bought a diesel generator and built a soundproof plywood box in the garage to store it in. He bought some items Mom didn't understand, like a dozen sheets of plywood, lumber, chicken wire, some cans of spray paint, 20 feet of copper tubing, connectors and valves, and a 5-gallon pressure cooker. With the money he had left, he bought a few dozen ounces of silver bullion and an ounce of gold in 5-gram bars. Week 1. At dinner one night, Mom tells Dad that a quarter of the stores in the mall have shut down and that food prices have nearly doubled. Dad had some worrying news too. The company he works for is planning to lay off 20% of the workforce. The next day, Dad gets to the utility bill and his jaw drops when he sees the electrical bill has tripled. On the way to work the next morning, he stops at the gas station to fill up and finds out that the cost of gas has tripled as well. Dad called a family meeting and told everyone that, while he had hoped everyone could resume their extracurricular activities by now, the economy was not getting better, and they will have to postpone all lessons and memberships until further notice. To save on the electric and gas bill, they need to keep most of the lights turned off and the heat turned down. Everyone will need to wear a sweater in the house. Also, Mom and Dad will have to carpool to save on gas. That weekend, Dad sells the BMW and buys a 10-year-old compact 4-cylinder rice burner. His co-workers and neighbors snickered and rolled their eyes when they saw Dad driving an old beater. But Dad had his reasons. In addition to saving on gas, this car won't attract the kind of attention the BMW did, and thus is less likely to be stolen or carjacked. Week 2. The next week, Mom goes to buy groceries but discovers that the farmer's market has closed. She drives through town looking for a grocery store that's still in business, passing storefront after storefront that has been closed down. She finally finds a store open and goes inside. Half the shelves are empty, and the bread now goes for $25 per loaf and milk at $50 a quart. Mom decides she's not going to pay those prices. They would just have to draw on their emergency supplies until prices come down. Mom called a couple of the farmers she befriended at the farmers market and asked if they had any food to sell. They said yes, but they could not take cash. Mom offered to pay them with half-ounce silver rounds, and they agreed. Mom and Dad drove out to the country and came back with potatoes, corn, a pork hind, and 2 chickens and a rooster so that they could have fresh eggs. On the way back, they drive past the seniors' building to tell them the bad news about the market closing down. But the building was empty and the doors chained. Where were all the seniors, Mom wondered. She would never have an answer. Week 3. That Monday, Mom finds out she has been let go from the hospital where she worked. Dad said not to worry because this way the kids can stay home from school and Mom can homeschool. The streets were getting dangerous and Dad was worried about the kids going to school anyways. The next day, Dad arrives at work to find his co-workers gathered outside the front door that has been locked up with a sign in the window that simply said, "Out of business." That night, there was the sound of breaking glass and yelling coming from down the street. The sky in the distance lit up from the fires started in some of the abandoned houses. There were no longer any emergency sirens. The police, ambulance, and fire departments were not responding to 911 calls. Dad calls the family together and instructs them that from now on, no one goes anywhere alone, that they should always travel in twos, and that everyone always carry a concealed pistol. The next morning, Dad gets some tools and lumber from the garage and boards up all the ground floor windows from the inside with plywood he had bought. He cuts a small slit in each sheet to act as a gun port. Dad then gets on the telephone and calls all his search and rescue team members. He suggests everyone check in once a day to make sure everyone is all right and to keep their radios on standby to receive emergency calls. That night, there was a banging on the front door. It's their neighbor, Bob, from 3 doors down. He came to check in on the family and thanked Dad for his advice. Bob had bought some emergency food supplies, and that while the rest of the neighbors were going without food, Bob and his family are well fed and safe. The next day, there was a letter from the township announcing the property taxes had been quadrupled and made retroactive, and that they now owe $9,000 in back taxes. The electric bill had doubled again. Dad took some of his silver bullion down to City Hall, where a few ounces paid all the taxes. With 1,000% inflation, Dad's silver was now worth 1,000 times what he had paid. And since they didn't bankrupt themselves paying for groceries and fuel, Dad still had enough money to pay the electric and phone bills. Week 4. One night, middle daughter developed a chronic cough. Mom's nursing experience told her that she was suffering from a respiratory bacterial infection. They would need to take her to the hospital to get her checked out. Thank God they still had health insurance. But when they arrived at the hospital, the doors were locked, and a large sign said that they had no medications or supplies left and could not accept any more patients. When they got home, Mom, knowing the family's medical history, knew it was safe to give middle daughter a course of amoxicillin. By the end of the week, she had completely recovered, and Mom thanked God that they had stocked up on medications. Dad then revealed the purpose of the copper tubing and pressure cooker. They were the components to a still. Mom was able to get 100 pounds of half-rotted potatoes from one of the farmers, and she began distilling spirits. They could produce about 5 quarts a week that they could use to barter with. All the liquor stores had been robbed and looted, and spirits were in big demand. The next day, eldest daughter said they were lucky the hospital was closed because there was a virulent strain of influenza with a 30% mortality rate, and it hit all the hospitals first, week 5. A radio call came in from Tim, who had joined Dad's search and rescue team. He said there were 3 cars parked out front of his house with men with guns. Dad told eldest daughter to call the team and tell them they were code red at Tim's. Dad grabbed his shotgun and his pistol and rode his motorcycle to Tim's house. When he arrived, there were already 4 of the other team members there, each armed. Using their radios, they coordinated a strategy. On his signal, Dad would come up from behind the looters. 4 would come in on their flank, and Tim would come out the front door. When the gang saw Tim coming out with his rifle, they swung their guns in his direction. But before they could fire a shot, the 4 team members flanking them opened fire. Tim opened fire from the front, and Dad opened fire from their rear. The gang was caught in a crossfire, and in a panic scrambled to their cars and drove off. After that incident, Dad suggested that the families in his team double up for protection. Bob and his wife and 2 boys would move in with Dad's family. With 4 adults in one house, they could take turns during the night to keep watch. Tim and the other team members agreed. Having 2 families in one house improved security and helped with the logistics. The next night, Tim's house was burned down. But Tim, his family, and all his supplies had already moved in with another teammate a mile away. Week 6. Eldest daughter took a keen interest in the ham radio and would monitor various frequencies for hours. She scanned for news reports and chatter from all over the world, and each day after dinner, she would tell the family what was going on in what everyone called the nightly news. The news was grim. Martial law was declared throughout the country. California went bankrupt, and arsonists set fire everywhere. Without money, there were no firefighters to respond, and half of California was on fire, with millions of homes and businesses destroyed. Every large city across the country had whole neighborhoods burned down. The influenza virus had spread across the globe, and the death toll was in the millions. Europe was even worse. There were widespread food riots in China. Similar events were occurring the world over. To keep up morale, Mom and Bob's wife organized nightly activities. There was art class, game night, story night, and on Saturday, music night. A few days later, a radio call came from one of the police officers Dad had met during his training with the search and rescue team. Officer Friendly told Dad that the National Guard is scheduled to arrive in town in 2 days, but they were not there to help. There was an order issued under martial law making it illegal to hoard food. They were going to do a house-to-house search to confiscate any firearms and food. Dad radioed all his team members to warn them to hide their food and firearms. Then Dad threw some furniture, garbage, and clothes in the front yard. He then broke all the windows and used the spray cans to spray graffiti and gang tags all over the house. He then spray painted the universal symbol used by urban search and rescue teams to mark the front of the house. The symbol stated that the house had been searched and 3 bodies recovered. With luck, the soldiers would deduce that the house had been looted by gangs, the inhabitants murdered, and a search and rescue team had come around to remove the bodies. Then Dad hid 90% of the food and all the firearms in a hidden space between one of the walls. He then took 10% of his food supplies and hid them in a box in the closet. He also retrieved his great-grandfather's .45 caliber pistol and kept it on him. Dad's plan was that if they were to be searched, he could give up the old pistol and the month's supply of food, and hopefully that would placate the soldiers. Over the next few days, eldest daughter monitored the ham radio and listened in on the military chatter. An army truck rolled past the house twice, but they didn't stop. Half the town had been looted already, and for the soldiers charged with searching for food and guns, going into a house that looked like it had already been looted was just a waste of time. Week 8. Eldest daughter received another radio call from Officer Friendly. He warned Dad that the National Guard and UN troops were going to make another, more thorough sweep of the town. But this time they were rounding up people to be relocated to a FEMA camp. "Whatever you do, don't let them take you to a FEMA camp," he warned Dad. Dad couldn't risk staying in town any longer. They would have to go to Uncle's country house. Dad called an emergency meeting to discuss the idea of evacuating to the country with his team. 3 other team members had cottages and family living in the country where they could go. Tim and Bob's family will go with Dad. There were still military roadblocks on every major road out of the town, but Dad knew that there was a paved bicycle trail that ran along the river and ended up on the outskirts of town. From there, they could take the back roads to Uncle's house and bypass the roadblocks. Dad, Bob, and Tim loaded up their vans, trucks, and cars, taped over their brake lights, and in a convoy of 8 vehicles, they left at 3 a.m. and drove along the bicycle trail with their lights off, staying in touch with their radios. Dad rode a quarter-mile ahead on his motorcycle to scout for possible trouble. By dawn they were in the countryside, and 3 hours later they were at Uncle's house. Uncle was happy to share his home, since living alone and only for yourself becomes tedious, and that the greatest joy truly lies in helping others. They all still had almost a year's supply of food, and all the generators, radios, firearms, and chickens. They were able to supplement their food by planting a large garden. They also had eggs from the chickens, and there was a stream and a lake nearby that provided fish, and Dad was able to hunt ducks and geese. Every week, Mom and Dad, wearing their search and rescue jackets and carrying a couple of quarts of Mom's moonshine, would go with Uncle and walk to one of the nearby farms to see if people still lived there. Several were abandoned. Either the owners never came back, or they went to the city to look for food. Most small farms were not being farmed and hadn't been for many years, and so when the local town grocery store closed down, many people in the rural communities were forced into the cities. They met 5 other families within a 10-mile radius who maintained their properties as small hobby farms and didn't have to go to the city for food. Mom would give them the moonshine as a welcome gift, and Dad and Uncle would explain that they were looking to build a community, that Dad and Mom were trained in search and rescue and medical care, and if anyone in their home was sick or injured, Mom and Dad would come to provide what care they could. They also shared the latest news from around the world that Big Sister provided, and they proposed the idea of bartering among the families. After a year, Dad's group was almost completely self-sufficient and still had 7 months' supply of emergency food left for everyone. Fluffy was quite happy on the farm and tolerated Bob's cat Shadow. Betsy the dog found 2 new friends in Tim's dog Thor and Uncle's old dog Barney. Mom and the other wives and daughters decided they needed to have a celebration, and so they planned a giant potluck dinner and invited all the 5 families to attend. Mom supplied the moonshine and wine she had been brewing, and Dad powered up the generator and hung Christmas lights along the trees and brought out Uncle's stereo, and they danced to classic rock and country. Then everyone gathered around the bonfire and told stories of what happened in the past year. The event was such a success that they all agreed to do it again every 3 months on the solstices and equinoxes. 3 years later, One day, Big Sister said there was exciting news. A provisional government had been established, and that a new currency, in the form of a microchip implant, was being issued. The power had been restored to a large part of the big city, and because so many had died during the Great Hunger, qualified people were urgently needed. Nursing assistants and electrical engineers were guaranteed a job in the city. That night, Mom, Dad, Uncle, and the kids sat around the campfire under the stars and discussed what they should do. Uncle said they were welcome to stay forever as far as he was concerned. Dad didn't like the idea of being microchipped just so he could work in the big city again. It sounded like another slave plantation scheme. Mom didn't look forward to going back to work in a big hospital, especially since there could be another outbreak of disease at any time and she could risk infecting the entire family. Big Sister had become almost as popular as she was on Facebook through her radio interaction, and she had friends from all over the world. She was also fond of one of the neighbor's boys, and so she was in no hurry to return to the city. Middle Sister learned from Mom how to grow medicinal herbs and treat various illnesses, and she was becoming an expert healer. She also had a crush on the younger brother of Big Sis's boyfriend. The youngest son had taken to the country and become an excellent fisherman, hunter, and expert at gathering wild edibles, and loved nothing more than roaming the countryside with his shotgun and Betsy the dog trailing along. They then took a vote. All in favor of going back to the city, raise your hands. Well, it's unanimous, said Dad. We're not going back. Thank you for listening. This story is just a fiction for now. When our society collapses, as all eventually do, it could go down in numerous ways. This is not meant as an exact prediction. Likewise, the solutions I describe may or may not work, depending on your situation. My intent is twofold. First, to scare people that have become complacent into doing something. Part 1 is meant to show that no matter how well off you are, or how many toys you possess, if you did nothing to prepare, you will go down just as fast as everyone else. Part 2 is meant to illustrate how working together with a few people you can trust is a major factor in survival. But more than just survival, it is the key to the survival of our civilization. Whether the end comes through war, pandemic, or economic collapse, the cause will always be the result of the degenerate, psychotic psychopaths that rule our world. And look what they have done. We no longer have our own countries. We no longer have our own communities. We no longer have families. We don't even have our own gender anymore. Why? Because it makes us weak, vulnerable, and dependent on the state. They know that a family, united by the bonds of common values and a common purpose, could change an entire community. That a community, united by the bonds of common values and a common purpose, could change an entire country. That a nation, united by the bonds of common values and common purpose, could change the world. The following will discuss the strategies and tactics described in Part 2. In this version of the story, Dad is just a regular guy, but he does have a little bit of critical thinking ability. He can see that the propaganda the media reports does not match the reality on the ground. He also feels uneasy. This is your instinct talking. Today, almost everyone I talk to feels uneasy and anxious. The pharmaceutical and liquor companies are making a fortune exploiting our misery. I don't think anxiety and depression are mental illnesses. I think it's our collective unconscious, our racial survival instinct telling us something is very, very wrong. Like the famous Krishnamurti quote, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. There are two ways of dealing with this malaise: retreat into denial, video games, drugs, and alcohol. Or the other way to deal with it is to get healthy, strong, and prepared to meet the danger head on. So, Dad does a lot of research, which is what everyone should do. Read history, read about what our ancestors did to survive, and about what's really going on in the world from a variety of alternative sources. What Dad does next is the crucial first step: making a plan. I can't tell you how important it is to make a detailed plan of what you would do should any number of negative scenarios come to pass. And write this plan out. Print off copies and give everyone in your family a copy. If your house burnt down while everyone was at work, where would you all meet up? If the power and cell phones went down, who would pick the kids up from school? If you had to evacuate, where would you go? If there are men trying to break into your house, what rooms should the family run to? And what would you do if the grocery stores shut down for a week? Once you have a plan, the next step is to get the items and resources you need to implement your counter strategy. If the power goes out, make sure you have a generator. If the phones go out, make sure you have a portable ham or CB radio in the car. If the stores close down, make sure you have a month's supply of food. And if criminals are trying to break into your home, make sure you have a shotgun. The second part of the plan needs to include training and education. A first aid course, a self-defense course, and a firearms safety course should be prerequisites for everyone. Then after that, your elective options could include medicinal herbs, wild edibles, gardening, wilderness survival, search and rescue, radio communications, and hunting and fishing, to name a few. In any survival situation, it is your intelligence, skills, and training that will trump all other considerations. Even if you can't afford to buy all the equipment and material you would like, don't worry. Being self-reliant mentally goes a long way to surviving. The third part of Dad's plan is the most important, and as we see in the story, the one that saved their lives several times. And that is building a community. History has shown us time and again that during times of national disasters and wars, it is small, tight-knit, unobtrusive communities that offer the best chances of survival and provide the best living conditions. But to do this, you have to put yourself out there. Dad puts a few ads up on the local chat boards calling for volunteers for a search and rescue team. He knows that the people to respond are likely to be rugged, honest, fit, and intelligent. No soy boys, couch potatoes, radical leftists, welfare refugees, or psychopaths would be interested in joining such a group. So Dad already filtered out the worst kinds of people that would destroy the cohesion of a community, which is why there is such a profusion of these types in society today, to destroy the cohesion of our cultures and our nations. There are several such groups you could form or join, such as volunteer ambulance, fire department, animal rescue, community gardening co-ops, food banks, Boy Scouts, if the liberals haven't already destroyed them, outward bound clubs, neighborhood watch, community emergency response team, or CERT if you live in the U.S., reforestation and environmental cleanup volunteers, hiking and kayaking clubs, All these groups will be composed of people that have skills and good character, and during times of national emergency, these groups would naturally form tighter bonds with each other. Mom builds community by forming a buy-in group with the ladies at the senior building and making friends with the local food producers. Mom also gives first by the simple act of baking cookies and giving them away. In order to ask others to cooperate, it is necessary to demonstrate your own willingness to give first. For less than $10 of ingredients and 45 minutes of your time, you could bake a lot of cookies. It's not rocket science. And who doesn't like homemade chewy chocolate chip cookies? My family in Holland didn't go hungry as much as most of the Dutch did during the war because my grandfather was close friends with many of the local farmers. My young uncles would take turns sneaking out into the country once a week to bring back fresh vegetables, eggs, and some meat. Next, we come to a couple of tactics used in part 2. The first is called playing the gray man. The Japanese, experts at stealth, called it the way of grass, and this is a tactic everyone should be starting to use now. This means to blend into the background, to be innocuous, to be so common no one takes notice of you. I use this tactic whenever I bicycle or walk through the city and may wander into an unsavory neighborhood. I dress like a homeless person. People will ignore you and leave you alone. In the theory of historical cycles, see my video of the same name, during the stage of corruption before the collapse, there is an increase in crime. Using the gray man tactic will reduce your chances of being targeted by criminals, both civilian and government. Dad is smart enough to realize that driving around in an expensive car was like painting a target on his back, so he traded it in for a junky old beater. Also, when the neighboring houses were being looted, Dad used the gray man tactic again by boarding up the house, breaking the windows, throwing garbage and furniture over the front yard, and tagging the house with gang graffiti and the international USAR, Urban Search and Rescue, symbol. By the way, how to read these symbols is also in my book. Next is the evacuation plan. For most disaster scenarios, your best option is to stay put or shelter in place. But if you did have to evacuate, part of your planning should include an evacuation plan that would designate alternate ways out of the city that avoid the main roads. Every one of the 6 towns and cities I've lived in the last 20 years have had paved bicycle trails leading to the outside limits of the city. These typically follow a river or creek and were thus lower than the surrounding terrain and usually had more trees and foliage, giving you cover when evacuating. In addition to the bike trails, I also found railway lines that would lead directly to the countryside. Best to have some bolt cutters to cut through the gates, and then you could drive on the shoulder of the tracks. I also keep a flashing blue light in the glove compartment that you can plug into the cigarette lighter and place on the dash panel. Anyone spotting you slowly driving along the bike trail or railroad track would assume you are a park or rail service employee. It is highly unlikely that criminal or military roadblocks would be set up along bike paths and railway tracks. The final tactic is one that I learned when I was 10 years old. In those days, I lived in a homogeneous suburb where all the neighbors knew and trusted each other, and no one locked their doors, their cars, or even their bikes. One hot and humid summer day, all the kids on the block wanted to go swimming to cool off. One of the neighbors, a tall Dutchman named Appie Krauf, who was also the chief of the local fire department, offered to take us all to Boyd Park, where there was a swimming hole we could all cool off in. And so 8 of us got into a station wagon, and off we went up the 2-lane blacktop. About a half a mile from the entrance to the park, all traffic had stopped. Half the cars were going to the park, and the other half were waiting to get past the park entrance so they could continue along their way. Appy waited until there was no oncoming traffic, then drove up the wrong side of the road to the park entrance. There he stopped the car in front of the gates, reached into his glove compartment, and pulled out his fireman's hat. Wearing only shorts, a Hawaiian shirt, and the hat, he walked out into the middle of the road. With his left arm outstretched, he waved his right arm back and forth. Within seconds, 50 or more cars pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Then he pointed his right arm behind him and waved his left arm to come forward. And seconds later, half the cars pulled back onto the now cleared lane and drove past the park on their way. Everyone knew right away what it meant. If you're going into the park, wait on the shoulder of the road so the rest of the traffic could pass. Now, all us kids knew Appy was the fire chief, but what about the people in the cars? Appy wasn't wearing a uniform, and it would have been too far away for anyone to read the insignia on his hat. But that hat gave him a symbol of authority. That, and his brazen actions of standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms around like he was in charge, is what convinced everyone to obey. We have all been trained to reactively recognize and obey authority symbols, but this can be used against the enemy too. I leave it up to you how to employ this tactic. Thank you again for listening. The strategies and tactics described here and more can be found in my book, The Art of Urban Survival.